Welcome to Critical Conversations for Radical Educators. I am Allegra Johnson, and I am presenting at the fourth Biennial Equity Ingenuity Conference 2026 on February 28th, 2026. My session is titled Growing Independence of Diverse Learners in Gen Ed. I am here to give you a snippet of what you can expect at the conference. So, when I think about growing independence of diverse learners in general education, the four things that I think need to be present and true is that the staff have a really deep understanding and belief in this idea of rightful presence, that the staff also have a really deep belief, embodied belief around this idea of presumed competence, that we are working very proactively to build affirming self-awareness for our students about who they are as learners and what means the most for them in their learning journey. And then that all of us, both educators and students, are really leaning into the belief of a growth mindset and putting practices and language behind that. These are the four main ideas that I will touch on in my presentation at the conference. But today I'm just going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek around this idea of rightful presence and presumed competence. So a little bit about what brings me into this work. My background is as a special education teacher and a special education leader. And when I was about in my third or fourth year of being a special education director, that is when I went and I got my doctorate, and the focus of my dissertation was around general education teachers' beliefs and experiences around including students with learning disabilities in general education. I was really intentional about the focus of my dissertation for a couple of reasons. One, I'm in California. California has a statewide mandate that we are going to, maximize the amount of students with IEPs in general education for at least 80% of their day. I also have a pretty extensive charter background, and in many of our charter networks, there is not a traditional kind of like self-contained and then inclusive environment for students with disabilities. It's typically like everyone is in gen ed the majority of the day, but there isn't necessarily like that intentionality piece behind it to really build the capacity of the staff to feel really comfortable and competent in providing the differentiation, the scaffolding that is truly needed for students with IEPs. And so the two things that I really focused on in my dissertation was one, again, asking general education teachers what were their attitudes towards inclusion of students who were included in their classrooms, and then how would they describe their experience. And overwhelmingly, regardless of content area, number of years teaching, gender, race, socioeconomic background, previous school experience, the teachers were just were expressing a really deep sense of frustration around their experience having students with IEPs in their classrooms. And it wasn't because they philosophically disagreed with the goals of inclusion. It was because they just didn't feel like they had the skill set to be successful. And they were just consistently seeing students with IEPs failing or what they believed to be underperforming in their classrooms. And they just didn't feel like they had the skills or the tools to be able to change that cycle. And that kind of led into how they describe their experience, really just expressing a lot of feelings of incapability, and then just kind of like fixed mindset around like the skills that I have as a general education teacher are not the skills that my students with IEPs need. And there's really nothing that I can do to shift that. There was like a real lack of sense of, um, what am I trying to say? Efficacy, a real lack of sense of efficacy around that. And so what this really led me to think about, particularly as a leader, as a special education leader, is okay, if we're in a situation where more and more students with IEPs are going to be included in general education teachers really are going to be more and more of the primary educator for students with IEPs, but they are inherently feeling frustrated and incapable about their ability to do this work with students, then as leaders, we really need to be thinking about in addition to really training folks on like the strategies and the skills, is really leaning into the beliefs. Like what are one of the limiting beliefs that folks have? What are the more empowering beliefs that folks need to have? How can we start to attach action to those beliefs and really just thinking about the work that we do, the coaching and the professional development work that we do with our teachers, particularly our general education teachers, in a different way to make sure that they have the appropriate belief behind the strategies that we're asking them to engage in. And so that's where these beliefs around rightful presence and presumed competence really come into the situation. So when I'm doing professional development or coaching general education teachers, this image that you see on the screen is something that I tend to share quite often. These can represent, and they can represent a lot of things, right? Like on face value, it can kind of represent all of the different configurations of how special education has rolled out in schools over the last 50 years. It can represent different configurations within classrooms. Like it can really illustrate and illuminate a lot around the ways that special education practices are enacted in our schools. And again, coming from a charter background where a lot of our students were already included like in person in general education classrooms, but they still weren't completely, I would say that there was really more of like integration happening than true inclusion. And I and what I have come to understand and really been focused on coaching teachers and coaching leaders around is thinking about what is the difference between integration and inclusion. Just because you have students in a general education classroom, if they are not believed to have full membership within that community, if they are not meant to, or if they're not believed to have like a right to be there, like a rightful presence to be there, then really we're not going to be able to get to that goal of inclusion because there is a disconnect between the way that teachers and sometimes even administrators and this can be general education teachers or special education teachers are thinking about the presence of the students in the classroom. And so this concept around rightful presence really originated when we were kind of talking about students with more, it originated from the disability community or the disability rights community. And it was initially really meant to focus on students who had more extensive support needs. But again, I think particularly if you are working in an environment where students with IEPs are being integrated into general education, but you feel like true inclusion or intentional inclusion is not happening, I think there's a lot that we can pull from this belief or this concept around rightful presence to really support us. So as you can see from the definition that's on the screen, rightful presence is really an approach to inclusion that emphasizes creating an environment where students with IEPs are treated as full members of the classroom community, not guests, not students who, are being allowed to be there by the general education teacher or kind of tolerated to be there by the general education teacher, but have full membership just as much as anyone else. Some maybe more colloquial representations of this idea that you may have heard is this belief that like special education students are general education students first, right? Like they have just as much of a rightful presence in all general education spaces as anyone else because they are general education students first. Some other kind of more common manifestations of this idea that you may have heard is that, special education is a place, or I'm sorry, special education is a service, it is not a place. The place, the rightful place of all students with IEPs is in general education, and then there's special education supports or services that are laid on top of it. And so again, if you're in a situation where you feel like you have a lot of students who are included in general education, but it feels a little bit more like integration and less around a real, true embracing of their full membership within general education. This is a really helpful concept to lean on. As a general education teacher, you can do self-coaching around this. As a school leader or a district leader, you can incorporate this idea into your professional development. But I think a real consistent and intentional engagement around this idea and really place like matching actions to this idea is very important around making our belief, I think, in general, in inclusion more meaningful, and then also helping general education teachers understand that in order to grow the skills of students with IEPs in their class, in order to grow their independence, like they have to first lead from the belief that all students in my class belong here, they all belong to me, I have the ability to support all of them. This kind of leads to another idea that I think is really important to intentionally coach around, and this is the idea of presumed competence. Again, this is an idea that originally originated originated from the disability rights community where we were talking about students who had more extensive needs, things like students who were nonverbal or maybe had intellectual disabilities. But I think again, this is an idea that's really important for us to pull in when we think about the inclusion of our students with more of those high incidence disabilities. So things like specific learning disability, other health impairment, other ADHD, um, higher functioning autism, like the students that we tend to see included more and more in general education. And again, this is an idea that really the both the teachers and the administrators need to hold because our actions lead from our beliefs. And if we are going to be asking people to differentiate and scaffold and make changes to their practices, they also that needs to be coming from an underlying belief where they are presuming the competence of all of the students in their classroom, regardless of any labels that are attached to them, that our students 100% have the potential to learn and understand all of the things that we are teaching and communicating to them, and that our responsibility as educators is really just to problem solve through the access points or the output approaches that we need for the students. So again, as you can see on the screen, this is another image that I tend to share quite frequently, particularly when I'm doing professional development with folks around the idea of universal design for learning and the strategy of universal design for learning is that if you want to move to the place where you're providing really accessible design and accessible curriculum to all of your students, those actions are just going to be a little performative if you do not also already have the belief where you are presuming that by making this curriculum or these activities or these resources accessible to all of the kids in your classroom, you're doing that because you have the belief that they're all going to learn and understand from it. And so again, I think there's just a piece again for us as leaders and for coaches where giving people strategy is kind of the easy part, but we also need to be able to narrate and coach them through what are the underlying beliefs that they need to hold in order for those strategies to be really meaningful and impactful for the students that they are working with. So presuming competence is a real important one that I think needs to be present again as we think about what are the beliefs that we need to hold and what are the actions that we need to take to make sure that we are growing independence of all students in gen ed, and particularly our students who are diverse learners. And so these are just two of the ideas that we're going to talk about during my session at the conference. Like I had shared, the other two ideas that we're really going to dive into is, okay, so we have a belief around rightful presence. We have a belief as educators around presumed competence. Now, what are some of the beliefs that we need to start to build within our students, and what are the actions that we can take so that we are starting to help students have a stronger self-awareness of who they are as learners, but in a very affirming and empowering way? And how are we using, strategies around growth mindset to help us meet those goals? And so, in addition to having a conversation about how all of these ideas really come together to support students with IEPs or students who are diverse learners in general education, What I'm going to make sure that you leave with are some very, very tangible, concrete next steps and resources that you could implement on Monday if you're a teacher, or that you can share with staff if you're an administrator, to really start to put this work in practice. And so some things that you will leave with after attending the session are some sample scripts if you are, an administrator or a coach, that you can use to help coach teachers through taking more of a, neuro affirming or neurodiversity affirming approach. There are going to be some sample student-facing activities that you can incorporate that really are going to get at this idea around creating affirming self-awareness for students and sharing with them some of the widely available accessibility tools that they can use to help accommodate for themselves, again, to grow that independence. But within that, also having conversations to help them understand who they are as learners and appreciate who they are as learners. And then I'll also share some sample reflection exercises in the form of a growing independence reflection journal that, again, either as a teacher you can use to self-coach, or as a coach or an administrator you can use to coach other folks. So I cannot wait to see you at the conference so that we can dive even deeper into this exciting work. And I hope this reaches you well, and can't wait to see you on February 28th.